What if I told you this is not the real image of Jesus, but this? What if I told you the white-skinned, blue-eyed, brown-haired image of Jesus you have in your cathedrals, homes, paintings, movies, in fact, everywhere, is nothing close to the true depiction of Jesus Christ of Nazareth? What if I told you that those images are not just artistically inaccurate, but fundamentally misleading about the very identity of the man who changed the course of history? In this video, we would explore the true identity of Jesus, using biblical references, historical contexts, archaeological discoveries, and scholarly research. We will delve into the true ethnicity and physical appearance of Jesus. And we would also uncover and tell you how this image of a white Jesus became dominant and accepted all over the world. Do well to watch to the very end so you don't miss out on any part of the story. Trust me, this is an interesting story you never want to miss. But before we begin, I would like to welcome you to our newly created channel. We're thrilled to have you join us on this incredible journey. Here you'll find captivating and enriching content and stories crafted with love and dedication just for you. We want you to feel right at home and enjoy every moment with us. To help us grow and continue bringing you top quality videos, we ask that you please hit that subscribe button so together we can build a large community for Christ. And that would go a long way to grow our growing community. God bless you as you do. Now let's dive right in. First off, let's start with how the white Jesus in our churches and homes came to be. The image of Jesus as a white-skinned man with European features didn't happen by accident. It was shaped over centuries by cultural, political, and theological forces. From the early days of Christianity, believers and artists sought to depict Jesus in a way that reflected their own environments and cultural ideals. One of the most iconic representations of Jesus comes from the Renaissance period. Artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci created images of Christ that were both divine and unmistakably European. Michelangelo's famous Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel portrays Jesus as a powerful muscular figure with light skin and wavy brown hair. Da Vinci's The Last Supper also shows a pale-skinned, gentle-looking Jesus surrounded by his disciples. These depictions became the default in Europe, not because they were historically accurate, but because they reflected the ideals and aesthetics of the time. Renaissance art celebrated the beauty of the human form, and what was considered beautiful in Europe was pale skin and European features. Jesus, in these works, became a reflection of European society's view of itself. But the spread of this image wasn't confined to Europe. As European powers began to expand their empires through colonization, they brought with them their culture, their religion, and their images of Christ. Missionaries spread the gospel, but they also spread a particular image of Jesus, the white Jesus. Across Africa, the Americas, and Asia, colonized peoples were introduced to Christianity through a European lens, and the image of a white savior became embedded in the religious consciousness of millions of people. This depiction of Jesus has profound implications. It not only shaped how people saw Christ, but also influenced how they saw themselves in relation to him. In many colonized societies, the white Jesus was used to reinforce ideas of European superiority and the inferiority of non-European peoples. The notion that God incarnate looked like the colonizers added a divine validation to the systems of oppression and hierarchy that European powers imposed. In many cases, the image of a white Jesus was used to justify colonial rule. European colonizers, who believed themselves to be racially and culturally superior, presented a Christ who looked like them, reinforcing the idea that they were closer to God. This was particularly damaging in the context of slavery. Enslaved Africans, brought to the Americas by European colonizers, were introduced to Christianity, but often in a way that reinforced their subjugation. The image of a white Jesus became a tool of control, used to suggest that Africans were inferior and that their salvation depended on submission to their white masters. Interestingly, the Bible is quite silent on Jesus' physical appearance. None of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, offers a detailed description of what Jesus looked like. For someone who plays such a pivotal role in history, this lack of description is curious. So, what can we infer from the little information that the Bible provides? There are a few passages that people often refer to when discussing Jesus' appearance. One of the most frequently cited is from the book of Revelation, in which John describes a vision of the risen Christ. John said, "His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters." This is from Revelation 1:14-15. The reference to feet like unto fine brass has led some to argue that Jesus might have had dark or brown skin, as brass is a metal with a brownish color. When brass is burned in a furnace, it turns even darker. Another passage often mentioned is Isaiah 53:2, which prophesies about the coming Messiah. It reads, "He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." This suggests that Jesus may not have been physically remarkable. He was likely an ordinary-looking man by the standards of his time, although this doesn't tell us much about his skin color or ethnicity. I know you would be asking, if the Bible offers so little information about Jesus' physical appearance, how can we make any assumptions about whether he was black? To answer this, we must turn to history and archaeology. Stay with me. Let's look at Jesus' geographic and ethnic context. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, grew up in Nazareth, and spent most of his life in the region now known as Israel and Palestine. This area, known historically as the Levant, has always been a crossroads of cultures, peoples, and empires. It lies at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and Europe, and has been inhabited by a variety of ethnic groups over the centuries. In the 1st century, the population of this region would have been made up of people with a range of skin tones, but the majority would have had brown or olive-toned skin, similar to people living in the Middle East today. The Jewish people, to whom Jesus belonged, were Semitic, a group that also included other populations in the region, like the Arabs. Semitic peoples typically had darker skin, though there was undoubtedly variation within the population. Moreover, Jesus lived under Roman rule, and the Roman Empire was incredibly diverse. People from North Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe would have been present in Palestine during Jesus' time. It was a melting pot of different ethnicities and cultures, with trade routes connecting it to Africa, Europe, and Asia. One significant piece of evidence pointing to the possibility of Jesus having darker skin comes from his family's flight to Egypt. In Matthew 2:13-15, we are told that Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus fled to Egypt to escape King Herod's massacre of young boys in Bethlehem. Egypt, located in North Africa, was a natural refuge for the family. If Jesus and his family were able to blend in among the local population in Egypt, it suggests that they did not look drastically different from the Egyptians, who were likely darker skinned. Africa plays a significant role throughout the Bible. From the very beginning, Africa is mentioned as a land of importance. In Genesis, the Garden of Eden is described as being near the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which are in the region that scholars identify as the Near East. But other rivers like the Pishon are said to run through the land of Cush, a region historically associated with Africa, specifically Ethiopia. This early biblical reference to Africa already suggests a deep, geographic connection between the biblical narrative and the African continent. Further along in the Old Testament, Africa continues to play a prominent role, especially in relation to the story of the Israelites. Egypt, one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, is mentioned repeatedly throughout the Bible. Notably, the story of Moses and the Exodus is set in Egypt, a land that had close contact with the Israelites for centuries. Egypt is depicted as both a place of refuge and oppression. In the case of Moses, it was where he was born and raised as an Egyptian prince before he led the Israelites out of slavery. In the case of Jesus, Egypt becomes a place of refuge for his family when they flee from Herod. But beyond Egypt, other African nations and peoples are mentioned throughout the Bible. Cush, present Ethiopia, Put, present-day Libya, and Seba are frequently referenced. In the book of Jeremiah 13:23, there is a rhetorical question: can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard his spots? This rhetorical question indicates that people from Ethiopia were recognized as having darker skin, which was considered a distinguishing feature. In the New Testament, one of the most intriguing references to Africans is the story of Simon of Cyrene, who helped Jesus carry the cross. Cyrene was a city in North Africa, in present-day Libya. Simon, a man from this region, was compelled by Roman soldiers to carry Jesus' cross on the way to the crucifixion. While there is no direct mention of Simon's skin color in the Bible, his geographic origin in North Africa strongly suggests that he was likely dark-skinned. Furthermore, one of the earliest converts to Christianity mentioned in the New Testament is the Ethiopian eunuch. In Acts 8:26-40, Philip, one of Jesus' disciples, encounters this man, an official in the court of the Ethiopian queen, and explains the gospel to him. The Ethiopian eunuch becomes one of the first non-Jewish converts to Christianity, symbolizing the early spread of the Christian message to Africa. These biblical references to Africa and African people suggest that the interaction between the ancient Israelites, the early Christians, and African populations was more significant than is often recognized. If people like Simon of Cyrene and the Ethiopian eunuchs played roles in the early Christian story, it stands to reason that people of African descent were present and active in the world of the Bible. This raises further questions about the ethnicity of Jesus and whether he, too, could have had African roots. Let's look at historical and scholarly views. Scholarly discussions about Jesus' ethnicity have evolved over time. For many centuries, Jesus was primarily portrayed through a European lens, especially in Western Christian traditions. However, as archaeology, anthropology, and biblical scholarship have advanced, new perspectives on Jesus' physical appearance have emerged. One of the leading voices in this debate is Dr. Reza Aslan, a scholar of religion and author of Zealot: The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. In his work, Aslan argues that Jesus would have resembled the average person living in first-century Palestine. This means he likely had dark, olive-toned skin, black hair, and Middle Eastern features. Aslan and others emphasize that Jesus was a Jewish man living in a region with Semitic peoples, who historically did not have the fair skin that later Western depictions would suggest. In the field of anthropology, researchers have reconstructed what they believe to be a more historically accurate image of Jesus based on skeletal remains and historical records from the time period. In 2001, a group of forensic anthropologists, using a combination of data from archaeological findings and descriptions of Semitic people in the region, created a digital reconstruction of what a typical Jewish man from first-century Galilee might have looked like. The result was a man with dark, olive skin, a broad face, dark eyes, and short, curly hair, quite different from the long-haired, pale-skinned figure most commonly seen in Western art. While this reconstruction doesn't claim to be an exact likeness of Jesus, it provides a more plausible representation based on the available evidence. It aligns with the idea that Jesus, being a Middle Eastern man, would have looked more like a modern-day person from that region rather than a white European with blue eyes. Some scholars go further in suggesting that Jesus could have had African ancestry, or at least connections to Africa through his familial or cultural background. This line of thought is bolstered by the fact that ancient Israel was part of a larger, interconnected Afro-Asiatic world. Trade routes, migration, and cultural exchange between Africa and the Near East were common, and there was significant movement of people between regions. The idea that Jesus or his ancestors could have had African roots is not far-fetched, given the historical context. The Afrocentric perspective on Jesus' ethnicity is particularly interesting in this regard. Afrocentric scholars argue that Jesus, given the historical and geographical context of his life, was more likely to have been black or dark-skinned. This argument is part of a broader movement to reclaim historical figures of African descent who have been whitewashed by Western historical narratives. Proponents of this view point out that Jesus' early followers included people from Africa, and that his flight to Egypt further strengthens the connection between Jesus and the African continent. Early Christian communities were diverse, spanning regions from the Levant to Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some of the earliest Christian art, especially in places like Ethiopia and Nubia, which is modern-day Sudan, depicted Jesus with darker skin. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, has long portrayed Jesus with dark skin in its religious art. In these depictions, Jesus is often shown as a black man, surrounded by other figures with similarly dark complexions. The fact that Ethiopian Christianity, which dates back to the 4th century, has consistently depicted Jesus as a black man is significant. Ethiopia's early conversion to Christianity and its historical isolation from European influence suggest that these depictions of Jesus were not influenced by Western ideals of beauty or race. Instead, they reflect the cultural and ethnic context of African Christians who saw Jesus as one of their own. In North Africa, early Christian communities also flourished. Alexandria, in Egypt, became one of the most important centers of Christian thought in the ancient world. Theologians like Augustine of Hippo, who was born in what is now Algeria, played a key role in shaping Christian doctrine. Augustine, one of the most influential figures in Christian history, was African, and many scholars argue that early African Christians would have viewed Jesus through a lens that reflected their own experiences and identities. The representation of Jesus as a black man in early African Christian communities challenges the notion that the white Jesus was the dominant image from the beginning. Instead, it suggests that early Christians in Africa, and possibly even in other parts of the world, had a more diverse understanding of Jesus' appearance. However, the notion of a black Jesus became a powerful symbol of resistance among enslaved Africans and their descendants. In African American religious traditions, especially in the context of the Black church, the image of a suffering Christ who identified with the oppressed took on new meaning. Jesus, who endured suffering and death at the hands of an unjust empire, became a symbol of hope and liberation for Black Christians. The idea that Jesus could have been Black only strengthened this connection, offering a sense of pride and identity to those who had been told they were less than human. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the image of a black Jesus has gained more prominence, especially in African and African American communities. The civil rights movement in the United States, along with the rise of liberation theology in Latin America and Africa, brought renewed attention to the idea of a black Jesus. Theologians like James Cone, often considered the father of black liberation theology, argued that Jesus must be understood as being on the side of the oppressed. For Cone and others, the idea of a white Jesus was incompatible with the message of the gospel, which calls for justice and liberation for the marginalized. White theology, with its emphasis on white Jesus, has failed to understand the biblical principle of God's preferential option for the poor and oppressed. Cone's work pushed the idea that Jesus, as a liberator, should be seen as identifying with black people and the struggles they face. In this context, the image of a black Jesus became a symbol of empowerment and resistance against oppression. For black Christians, especially in the United States and Africa, the idea of Jesus as a black man took on profound significance. It wasn't just about reclaiming history, it was about reclaiming dignity, identity, and a sense of belonging in a world that had used religion as a tool of control and marginalization. As more black theologians, artists, and activists embraced the image of a black Christ, this idea began to spread globally. In the African American church, the notion of a black Jesus offered a powerful counter-narrative to centuries of racism and exclusion. For many, the black Christ became a symbol of divine solidarity with the oppressed, offering not just spiritual salvation, but also a message of social and political liberation.